Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. Good morning if you're in North America. Good afternoon if you're in Europe. It's 8 in the morning in the central time zone in North America. I think it's early afternoon in Europe. My name is Deane Barker. I work for Optimizely, which is a DXP vendor, and I am joined by two friends from Siteimprove and American Eagle. We'll meet them in just a bit. We are going to be talking about inclusivity and driving engagement through accessibility and how you can use accessibility to increase the value of your experiences for your customers and for your organization. This is what our agenda looks like. First of all, I'm going to frame the discussion just a bit about why accessibility matters and what value you can use perhaps for selling an accessibility initiative to your organization. And then we're going to be talking about the pitfalls of making content accessible, with the problems you could run into driving accessibility initiative forward. And then we're going to talk about how to do this at scale. Once you have an accessibility initiative set up, how do you manage that over time over a large digital estate? And then hopefully at the end, I'll come back on and we'll do a little bit of Q&A. As I said, my name is Deane Barker. I'm the Global Director of Content Management at Optimizely. Optimizely is a company that sells a DXP platform. We traditionally were known in the CMS space. In the last few years, we've become a full DXP product suite. I am joined by my friends Nick from American Eagle. He manages their front-end development and accessibility practice. And then I'm joined by Inka, not my first time doing a webinar with Inka. Inka works at Siteimprove, and I'm going to warn you in advance that Inka is sitting in a room that may automatically turn the lights off on her. So if Inka suddenly goes dark, we've told her that she has to get up and do a TikTok dance to get the lights going on again. So these are my two friends. I'm going to talk for just a bit. I'm going to turn it over to Nick. Nick's going to talk about pitfalls you could run into with your practice. Then Inka's going to come on and talk about doing this at scale. And then hopefully we'll get a chance to do some Q&A. Again, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box that's right there on your toolbar. First of all, I just want to frame the discussion a bit about why accessibility matters. For many of you, this makes total sense. Others of you, it may make sense to you, but you have to sell this initiative to your organization. I'm going to talk about three things here. I'm going to talk about how accessibility reduces your legal risk. Now, I'm going to frame this in terms of North America, but there have been some developments in Europe that I'll talk about and why this is going to become a future legal problem for European companies. I'm going to talk about how it allows you to connect with a wider audience. I think accessibility just drives improvements far beyond just accessibility. And then finally, I'm going to talk to you about some social, psychological aspects of why accessibility is fundamentally the right thing to do. Accessibility, first and foremost, especially here in North America, reduces your risk. And let me explain what this means for companies in North America and explain kind of how this is now filtering over to Europe. In the United States, this is Marcy Lipset. Marcy Lipset was a higher education advocate for the disabled. I worked at a services company 5 or 6 years ago, and we started to get lots of requests for colleges, universities here in the United States to do accessibility audits. And this lady was the reason. She ended up filing thousands of complaints under a law in North America called the Americans with Disabilities Act. And she started filing all of these complaints, which caused all these universities to have to stop and do usability audits of their websites. Many of the websites didn't comply with the usability laws over here, and it caused massive expenses for those usabilities, and appropriately so, in order to kind of stop and re-engineer their websites. And so this is what really started the most recent drive towards accessibility in North America. The courts have picked up on this. This is a famous accessibility ruling here in the United States. It was Domino's Pizza. Pizza vendor here in the United States was sued by a blind man that was trying to order pizza online and couldn't using their website. This ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court here in the United States, and the Supreme Court ruled against Domino's Pizza. The actual ruling was fairly small, but the precedent it set was very, very large in terms of what organizations here in the United States could be responsible for in terms of their web presence and how that would make them liable for US accessibility laws. And then this really ended up increasing the level of usability lawsuits and claims here in the United States. We had a small downturn in 2020, probably something COVID related there. But as you can see, the number of complaints and lawsuits filed every year over digital disability has increased every single year. Now you're thinking, well, I'm in Europe, that really doesn't apply to me, but it is very much going to. The EU has had the Web Accessibility Directive since 2016, which is applied to public agencies in the EU, but that is about to be supplemented by the European Accessibility Act. The European Accessibility Act requires member nations to come up with laws and guidelines by the end of the year. And those laws and guidelines, I believe, will start to be enforced in 2025. So if Europe can look at the experience of the United States, very clearly there was a high legal risk for organizations in the United States. This caused those organizations to be the target of several lawsuits and required large services investments to do accessibility at their organizations in response to these legal threats. So there really is a value in you getting out in front of that. The second point I want to make is accessibility absolutely increases your reach. It increases your ability to connect with your customers and your potential customers. I think when we talk about accessibility, we really suffer from tunnel vision. When we think about accessibility, we are thinking about people who are acutely physically handicapped. We think of this, and I don't know who this gentleman is. This is a public domain picture I found. This is a blind gentleman. He's using a screen reader. This is the vision that many of us have when we think about accessibility. This person is clearly acutely physically disabled, and this is the person we need to account for. And very, very commercially, we may look at this and say, well, how big of our audience is this? Do we really need to account for this in a business standpoint? And what I'm going to argue is that we very much need to broaden our view of accessibility beyond just this gentleman in this particular use case. I think there are many ways of considering a disability, because many disabilities are what we would call situational disabilities, which is a disability put in place because of someone in a particular situation. So if we consider accessibility more broadly, there are people who have progressive limitations as they age. For instance, I turned 50 last year. My eyesight is not what it used to be. So as people get older, their limitations and their affective disabilities increase. I find myself increasing the font size on my phone, increasing the font size on my Kindle, just because my close-up eyesight is not what it used to be. Additionally, I mentioned situation accessibility issues. There are people that might be accessing your website on lower hardware that they normally do. They might be using a different machine. They may be in a high noise environments. My daughters send me Snapchats all the time, and if I'm lying in bed in the morning next to my wife, I don't want to play a video because it has sound. That's an environment where I really can't use sound. I really need captions in that particular environment, or a low visibility environment. Maybe I'm in a situation where I can't see the screen, or the content is being displayed on a visual display that's 25 feet away from me. And then finally, there are information access issues. There are more and more people connecting through low bandwidth environments. I've had conversations with Scott Hanselman, who's a developer advocate for Microsoft. His wife is from Zimbabwe, and he's traveled to Africa several times. And he says your relationship to the internet is fundamentally different in Africa, because in many places you have much, much lower bandwidth than you would, say, in Europe or in North America. So if we broaden our view of accessibility and we kind of remove that tunnel vision that causes us to concentrate just on acute physical disabilities, we find that instead of this, we may look at this and think, well, the orange slice represents some of our sales that would be affected by someone who was disabled in some sense. You might find that if you broaden your view, it ends up looking like something like this. The majority of your sales, the majority of your customers, the majority of your prospects are affected by some situational or progressive disability that you can account for. And what I've come to understand, I've been doing web development now since about 95, is as a general rule, I think it's very safe to say an accessible website is a more effective website for everyone. By taking accessibility into account, you not only make your content accessible to those suffering from some type of disability, but you really make it more effective for everyone. And I'm going to point you back to a book that was published 15 years ago, 16 years ago. It was my first introduction to accessibility, and this happened in the early 2000s. It was a book called Dive into Accessibility by Mark Pilgrim, and the book is actually available for free. It doesn't so much apply anymore. This was back when we were building websites with table-based layouts. But I remember reading this book. I actually read it in a car on a road trip, I think, to Minneapolis. And I remember how it fundamentally affected how I planned and built websites. What I found is that the web was designed to be accessible. We just made it less accessible. The fact is the accessibility tools in the web are there. We've just spent many, many years limiting them and going around them. And this book, Dive into Accessibility, which again is available for free. I recommend it. Some of it's not valid anymore. Will make you kind of take a step back and understand that the web was engineered for accessibility. We've just done a very good job at ruining that over the years. I see Nick laughing, so Nick knows. Third, this is the really humanistic aspect of that, is that accessibility is just the right thing to do. I'm a big believer in content's ability to connect human beings. I think content is a tool that we use to have human connections with other people. And I'm going to start this by referring to this moment in pop culture. And some of you may recognize this. This is the moment where Ross finally kissed Rachel in the second season of Friends. And the reason why I mention this is that I was 23 years old when this happened, 24 maybe. And I was sitting in my crappy apartment in college, and I was watching this at 7:30 at night. And I worked in a call center at the time, and none of us really liked to work. We sat around and talked. And I remember watching this and thinking to myself and looking forward to the day at work tomorrow, because I knew that I was going to talk to everybody about this. This was this moment that we shared. Millions and millions of people were watching this moment. In North America, the other example I've used is the final episode of MASH, which was a sitcom in 1983, became the most watched TV show for 27 years. And 1/3 of the United States was watching this show. And this gave birth to what they call water cooler TV, which is the idea that we watch something on television, and then the next day we all kind of stand around the water cooler at their office and talk about it. And what that speaks to is the ability of content, the ability of stories, the ability of narrative to connect us as human beings. I'm going to refer to a great book called The History of the News. It's by an NYU professor named Mitchell Stevens. And Mitchell Stevens has written about the news as a social construct, as the sphere of information that we share as human beings. And I've always loved this quote from his book. He writes, "Societies depend for their unity and coherence on a sense of group identity." I love that phrase, group identity. Ross kissing Rachel in the second season of Friends, that was a piece of information that gave us a group identity. We had all watched that. To think a society's thoughts is to belong to that society. Content, Mitchell says news, but I've replaced that with content, provides the requisite set of shared thoughts. And I don't think that we think about content that way enough. We think we need to think about content as really the shared common thread of thoughts through a society. This is backed up by another professor, a UCLA professor, who wrote a book called Rational Ritual, which is about societal rituals. And if you look at the cover of the book on the left, you can see a bunch of people. And if you're from North America, you understand what they're doing. They've got their hand over their heart and they're saying the Pledge of Allegiance here in the United States. And this is a ritual that we share. And he writes, "Common knowledge depends not only on me knowing that you receive the message, but also the existence of a shared symbolic system, which allows me to know how you understand it." And this is an example of how content unites us. Content, especially digital content, really unites us around this kind of shared system of societal values and societal information. And I'm going to finish this up by talking about Fiorello LaGuardia. Fiorello LaGuardia was the mayor of New York back in the 30s. And in the 30s, they had a strike for newspaper carriers. The newspapers were still being published, but several parts of the city couldn't get the newspaper because the carriers had gone on strike. And Fiorello LaGuardia, the airport's named for him, was a colorful character, and he used to go on the radio and read the cartoons on the radio. And what he started to do was he started to read the headlines on the radio because he felt like his city was coming apart because so many people in his city had been isolated from the news. The news was still happening, they just couldn't read about it. In fact, there was a survey that was taken of New Yorkers that weren't able to read the newspaper. And here are some, I won't read all of these, but here are some of the reactions to the loss of the newspaper. I mean, if you read through some of these people are really suffering from low-grade depression. They have been excluded from a sphere of information that the rest of their peers has access to. And this is causing them to feel withdrawn from society. I've spoken about this before. I actually I did a keynote presentation called "Content is the Currency of Human Connection." The fact is, the way that we buy connection with our customers and with our prospects and with our visitors and with anybody who needs to consume our content is with that content. It is the currency with which we connect human beings. We connect ourselves with our audience, and we connect ourselves with our ability to change our audience thoughts and feelings and actions. There is actually a psychological concept called social exclusion, which can be incredibly damaging to human beings. When humans are excluded from social institutions, They suffer deep, deep withdrawal and symptoms of depression. And I think that we need to start looking at content that way. Content is fundamentally a social institution in this country. Human beings connect over content, and we talk about content, we associate over content. And when you exclude somebody from your content, you are excluding them from that aspect of society. And I maintain, this may seem grandiose, but I'll absolutely defend this. To exclude somebody from content is really to exclude them from some level of human connection. And we fundamentally should strive to avoid that purely on a human level. Okay, so I've preached for 10 or 15 minutes about the importance of accessibility. What I am going to do now is I am going to turn this talk over to the practitioners. Nick, who is the head of front-end development and accessibility at American Eagle, is going to take the screen from me now. And Nick is going to talk to us a bit about common pitfalls that you might run into when setting up an accessibility practice.
Thanks, Deane. Yeah, Deane got to cover a lot of why you should be doing this and really important points. So now let's get into what are some of the things that maybe in your organization for your site creation you're not thinking about. So what are the common mistakes that I'm seeing interacting with many, many different clients around inclusivity and accessibility? So first, you got to ask yourself, is the project yourself, are you being inclusive in doing the project management of it? The most common one is we think about, okay, well, we're going to make user stories, and we're going to plan out the functionality of the whole entire website. So we're going to say, okay, as a user, I want to be able to open the member dropdown. But really, you've got to start writing your user stories with all types of users, including those with disabilities. So you could say, as a user with cerebral palsy, right? Maybe I have low motor function. I want to be able to open that member dropdown. And so it's hard as humans for us to step out of our own shoes or step and think about other users. And so putting this into your user stories starts to get people thinking about how do we accomplish that? So how do I account for, as a user, as a keyboard user, being able to expand open that dropdown? And the things we build and implement, as Deane was kind of getting at, it can benefit everyone. You think about, in the physical space, ramps. As a parent, I've used them with strollers. It's been a very nice convenience. Then OCR, so optical character recognition. I also had to do, a small task back in the day in college of doing data entry. I had to take the physical forms people were filling out and then fill it out again online. And so with OCR, you could actually scan the documents and save time. And planning for accessibility up front really saves money and time. Depending on estimates, depending on how pervasive the problems are, doing it after the fact could even increase the amount of effort by like 1.5 to even 2 times the amount of work. And accessibility as an afterthought ends up with really kind of a worse product. So that's why I have the example here of a picture of the wheelchair ramp available. Please ask at counter, like posted up inside a store. And some of you might start to realize, how do I go inside a store to ask to get inside a store, right? And so that's, again, it could be compliant because you can ask for it and you can come in, but as a user experience, that's not realistic whatsoever. And that's why after the fact approaches often fall short. So every user, or every person in your team needs to think about accessibility. So we're doing planning early, great. Let's get into development. Not saying designers aren't important, because they actually can make mistakes and have implications as well, but I'll focus a little bit on developer gaps today. Because really, accessibility is rarely taught in any school or boot camp. If there is some inclusion, it's maybe an hour pitch by someone, or maybe a half a day. And that's really not enough. And that's because many devs do not have experience with users with disabilities. Now, inclusivity and diversity of your team can increase the chances that someone has actually interacted with someone with a disability, or even incorporating people with disabilities themselves. Then, unfortunately, as Deane was kind of saying, it's gotten a lot more complex, but there's a lot more flexibility now. So with HTML5, devs can pretty much do anything they want. They can even get into shadow DOM and create whole entire structures that don't even exist inside the spec. And then CSS is able to reorganize the whole entire layout and flow of a whole entire site without actually adjusting the logical concept of it. And JS, now you can put just clicks anywhere. I'm going to put clicks on every single thing, even though it probably shouldn't. And so we then have all these frameworks. It's gotten so complex. We've got CMSs, we've got content management systems, we've got whole entire JavaScript frameworks in order to help set things up, but we're relying on them. And is accessibility accounting for all the users inside that product? And that's why I'm not trying to be mean, that it's pervasive. It's everywhere. But Angular, so we have a screenshot of the GitHub repo of Angular. And so great, Angular components have resolved 339 accessibility or A11Y bugs. Why were there 339 bugs to begin with? But there are still 302 open. So there could be many users using this framework that may not be able to access your site. So then we develop, okay, well, what about QA? There's a lot of criteria, a lot of nuances to account for all the different user types. And there are a fair amount of WCAG criteria to begin with. So it's actually easy, I've seen this with QA teams, where it's easy to spend a larger amount of effort on less impactful items when testing without assistive technology or AT. And the most common one I always point out is a lot of the automated tools will point out, oh, well, you did B tags instead of strong tags. And it's like, well, no assistive technology does anything with that. It reads it as text regardless. So you could be spending a lot of time on something that has very little impact. But you could have that same user pretty much not be able to use your menu, for example. And that's why human involvement is really important. And then there's really gaps when you don't include people with disabilities, again, in the testers, in the QA process. So that's why I give another accessibility fail image here with a hotel room, most likely with the number 309 on it. And Braille underneath that does say 309, but you might be realizing it's on a textured plaque that has dots and texture and smoothness. How would a user that's blind actually know what's the Braille versus what's stone? So does your QA know when there actually are issues? And so let's get into then end user feedback, right? So not just your testers, but inclusivity into incorporating all kinds of users. And really many products and sites do not include a broad and diverse end user, like base pretty much. So without feedback, major gaps are missed. So for example, I give the Twitter support tweet from like 2020, where they pretty much had to apologize. They said, oh, we're sorry about testing voice tweets without support for people who are visually impaired, deaf, or hard of hearing. It was missed to introduce this experiment without this support. Accessibility should not be an afterthought. So even big names are getting it wrong. It's not to be mean against Twitter. All the big names are making these big mistakes because they're not getting end user involvement. And you may think, okay, I'll do it at the end, but incorporate it in your prototype phases, because you can save a lot of time and effort, because really at the end of the day, you want your product, you want your website, you want your entity to be useful to people. And so does a diverse set of users actually use or want to use the project? And so that's why I also include an image of many countries include kind of a yellow textured line for people with low vision to be able to, like canes, to be able to feel along the way. And all the examples, I believe it's in Turkey, of literally going into walls, going into bus stations, bus stops, and going into glass and running people into things. And you can guess why that's not really useful. So I can't get into all of them because that would actually be a lot. But let's get into some overlooked web-based issues. So Twitter, for example, okay, overlooking it. Or infinite scroll, what are the implications for all the user types for that? So a common one I still see to this day, after years and years and years of covering this, ever since the iPhone in like 2008, where we have touch-based users, I still see this. It's got to be hover, but just on web. most software everyone uses on a regular basis does not use hover as functionality. Maybe you get some nice finesse styling or something to indicate that I'm hovering over an item, but it's not actually to do something. And that's because somewhere in the web in the early, late 90s, early 2000s, people forgot the most common user until the mouse was keyboard. Every user input device has a form of pressing or clicking or interacting with some down measure for an interface. Hover and focus is also not a form of intent. That's why I animated for just a brief second, but show kind of the older menu for Amazon that was hover-based. And everyone references it and goes like, well, they're hover. And I was like, well, keep in mind, they also had to do a lot of work to even get that to work, because hover is not really, again, a form of intent. And it also creates tunneling issues. If you've got, like we talked about with cerebral palsy, where, okay, how do I actually get into that menu without somehow triggering other menus? And they had to write a whole entire triangulation algorithm to determine if, as a user, you were trying to get into the menu. So you're creating extra effort and extra maintenance to put something in for just one user type. And Amazon's newer one actually does not use hover anymore. And so, yeah, the common culprits are navigations and flip cards. Common one I always have to talk about with everyone up front is missed video needs. Really, videos becoming Snapchat, right? We've got TikTok, we've got social, with so much with video, because the internet, I guess not everywhere, but internet is actually a bit faster nowadays, so people use video more. But videos aren't great, again, if you just exclude people from it. And so you also need captions. We have live captions in right now. You need transcripts, descriptive ones, explaining what's going on, and audio descriptions. So in real time, people can hear what's happening inside the video. And again, when talking about positives, if you actually have dedicated video pages, Google's not going to crawl your video, but it will crawl a descriptive transcript on that page. So you have an SEO win-win. So the examples here, I have, even big names are including it with, if you want to see it, you can go to YouTube. Apple has one for Sadie with audio descriptions. Just even look up videos with audio descriptions and you'll see a huge list. Able Player is another one that I showed, where actually they even set it up so with VTT, so with actual way to do transcripts with timestamps, to say, okay, as it plays, announce these things, or even highlight it as they move along. Then we have a reliance on PDFs. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of why are people still using fax machines? Well, I guess there's still some use cases. And we still have a reliance on PDFs when really the web is a much more flexible and accessible approach than PDFs. Not throwing it under the bus, it's not, there are use cases. But if the only way you're expressing your information is through a PDF in the end, that might be a red flag for your content creation process. Because InDesign and Word, they try hard to export into good PDFs, and there are ways to make it so that it's much better start than not being aware of it, right? But they often don't export perfectly accessible versions, and you still have to do remediation for it. And that's why most content and creative teams, I see them roll their eyes like, I have to do this now, where I have to fix these things. And there are tools, there are companies out there that can help with that. But it's, again, a reminder to ourselves, does it really need to be a PDF? But there are standards in progress and in place. So PDF UA has alignment with WCAG 2.0, 2.1 and other newer aspects coming into play. That's a different story, but they are focused on trying to make sure people can make accessible options. But really what it is inclusivity amongst all this could help solve the biggest gap, which is the lack of knowledge and awareness. And that's where Inca can help step in and start actually explaining, okay, well, we have all these problems, what do we do? Take it away, if you can.
Thank you, Nick. So you should be seeing my screen now. All right, yeah, so we went actually with Nick last week to an assistive tech conference in Los Angeles called CSUN, as a conference that gathers thousands of accessibility people and vendors together annually. And what really, struck me is how many people who work with accessibility are describing themselves as firefighters. I heard quite a lot of people saying, we're still trying to understand, the full scope of the accessibility of our digital assets, or we're still trying to get a buy-in from management. And meanwhile, they are also struggling, kind of like putting down the worst fires. And here's the thing. If you are responsible for your website experience, if you're responsible for brand trust, diversity and inclusion, and your time is spent on firefighting, you are not doing yourself a favor, right? You're pouring water basically into a well. Web accessibility is a team sport that requires all the players in a team to understand their role. And I have added on this slide an illustration of basically a tactical scheme of a football match. The real football, not the American kind. No, Deane and Nick are like, what? That doesn't look like football. And what I want to say with this is that your players need to understand both the game strategy as well as their roles and responsibilities before they can play well together, right? So everyone who touches your website, developers, designers, content authors, marketeers, they need to understand the accessibility strategy and their responsibilities in relation to that. And you, perhaps as a driver of content excellence, your job is to provide these players the tools and education they need in order to succeed in their job. This is how you will see change happening. And you might think, okay, nice high-level metaphors, Inga, but how does this actually relate to reality? So let's drill into Nick's point about missing user stories, that teams who build and maintain websites do often not fully understand the permanent, temporary, and situational needs users have. And thus they are building websites that do not work for everyone. You know why they do not understand? They do not understand because many development teams look like the cutout images you see on this slide now. On the pictures, we have a homogeneous bunch of male programmers in the age of 40 to 45. Which takes me to my next point. Empathy is the most powerful skill a developer can have. But even better, you should hire diverse teams, hire people with disabilities. When your team looks like the customers you are serving, you are rewarded with empathy. And that is why inclusive workplaces are innovative workplaces. Well, should your team now look like this all-male panel, the best thing you can do is involve real users with real needs. And when it comes to accessibility specifically, there is this notion of nothing about us without us. The input your web team gets defines their output. Do you see the mismatch between your users and your web team? Empathy means that your team understands there are various temporary and situational needs, as well as permanent needs, and that by addressing them, you're able to build better services for everyone. Who is your customer? Is it people with disabilities? Of course it is. It's the aging population who want to remain active in society. It's this, woman in the corner of the slide who seems to be having an extremely bad day, probably can't really concentrate. When you have a process at place for addressing all these needs, you will start seeing profit. And what kind of profit am I then talking about? Why are there actually right now so crazy many jobs open for accessibility specialists? It's quite rare that the right thing to do is the most profitable thing to do, but this happens to be the case with inclusivity. There's a research by Deloitte that concluded that inclusive companies are 6 times more innovative, 6 times more likely to effectively anticipate change, and 2 times more likely to meet or exceed financial targets. And the reason why companies address accessibility has changed from this, compliance need that Deane was talking about to understanding of the incremental profit that comes out of better user experience that you can achieve through inclusive design. And something that Nick also mentioned, your page quality will increase and positively impact your search engine visibility. And that will also lower your search advertisement costs. So it's just, wins after wins after wins. I also want to make a point that working on accessibility now, you are future-proofing your digital presence. This could be, for instance, consistent labeling practices and readability. Those will prepare you for the rise of voice technology that we will see more and more in Europe as well. And accessibility is becoming a, page quality indicator for search engines, perhaps, to name a few things. So yes, by being inclusive, you are opening to all the customers you were not serving before. You are sending a message that you're, purpose-driven, both to your potential customers and your own employees who want that your corporate values match with their personal values. And the directly measurable benefits are just the tip of the iceberg. So how do you address these knowledge gaps that Nick was talking about? Let's imagine that you would have a small and mighty team of accessibility specialists, or maybe even just one. In order to free that person's time for things that matter, you want to educate everyone else, the whole football team, on basics. You have different ways of doing this. You can introduce self-paced learning through, for instance, an online academy. You can hire a consultant to work together with your teams to build knowledge. And then there are tools like Siteimprove that highlight issues automatically and guide users on best practices, enabling them to learn hands-on and independently. I'd like to think that you need all of these. So this is how a training path for a designer could look. Online academies are great ways to get started with building knowledge from the ground up before you bring an instructor, led accessibility training for different roles, for instance. If you're investing on a consultant trainer, it makes sense to use their time wisely, getting deeper into the topics, because there's so much to learn. Why I'm mentioning this is that our online academy has several free courses that you can also use to maintain any accessibility certifications you may have with the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, or then just, get started with the basic concepts. So if you search with Siteimprove Academy, you will find a lot of material to get started. And then an example of hands-on learning, something we do with Optimizely is that we, as an accessibility monitoring tool, have an integration bringing accessibility and inclusivity checks into the editing environment of the content management system. It's something that you can see on the slide here. The idea is basically that content editors who create content can check their content for accessibility errors before they publish. And this is also how you can as well learn when you have a system that is built to both, highlight errors, but also to educate the content contributor on the user impact. Basically, they're able to learn while they're working on that one piece of content. And once this content creator has forgotten the alternative text on their image a few times and told, to add it by the system, they will learn and start including it. And you have actually taught somebody something without even talking with them. Yeah, and how does this work? It's basically in the Optimizely editing environment, you click on this little logo on the upper right corner, and we're going to crawl the page. And while the page is being crawled, you can see, the results for each area. In this case, we'd looked at accessibility issues, potential misspellings, the readability level, all a part of inclusive content, and any custom content rules this organization would have implemented. Maybe they want to use certain terms when talking about gender or disability, for instance. And then these inclusivity issues are directly highlighted in the editing environment so that the content contributor can easily fix it. And this type of contextual guidance is super effective because you get only, the guidance you need, right? Nothing less, nothing more. If you take the approach of, trying to learn the whole VCAC criteria and then try to remember what criteria and technique applies to, whatever piece of content, you're easily going to feel overwhelmed. It's this kind of, contextual knowledge you need in order to be effective. The last point I want to highlight is about involving users. How can you gather end user feedback, especially feedback from people with disabilities? Something that Nick mentioned. Well, the first thing is, of course, make it easy to provide input. And often you'd provide a feedback channel along your accessibility statement. If you haven't heard what an accessibility statement is before, or you do not have an accessibility statement, the purpose is basically to have a place to tell your site visitors about your commitment to accessibility and the errors there are on the website. That's basically a good place to start making sure you have one. It's a bit of a sad fact, but the more accessible your website is, the more likely you are also to get accessibility feedback. So if your website is really bad in terms of accessibility, you can't really expect anybody to bother to help you improve. People will just, take their business somewhere else. And lastly, there's, of course, usability testing that can be conducted with people who have various needs. So in summary, your journey from a firefighter to installing sprinklers could look like this. You would start by getting an overview and an understanding of the level of accessibility of your digital assets, like videos and PDFs that Nick mentioned, automation and manual testing. Your websites will be the solution for this. Then you can build a training plan addressing empathy and accessibility skills through online academies, instructor-led trainings, and hands-on learning. So all of those three. It's really important to remember to involve users with real needs. The input you get defines your output. And the fourth point, you want to prevent accessibility issues from ending up on your website to begin with. This is achieved through tools and processes that will alert you of potential issues before publishing, and also monitoring content that you're building and so on. So as early as possible. Well, that was all that I had.
Whenever we do this, and Inka, this is the second time I've done one of these presentations with you, I'm always nervous because I toss around theory and you two are the practitioners, but there are three themes that I pulled out and some of them validate what I said earlier. I think the three themes that I pulled out were from both Nick and Inka, and then some of the things that I said is that you really want to address accessibility earlier rather than later. You see that with physical accessibility problems. If you have an office that is not accessible, it's much cheaper to fix that when you're building it than retrofit it in after the fact. And the same is true on the web. Also, inclusivity during the design and the testing process. Inka, I liked your diagram of a bunch of older white male programmers that probably aren't really represented. We'll return to that with a question in just a second. And then finally, access equals profitability. And that sounds very commercial and very crass, and I don't mean it to. But Inka, you talked about the fact that if your site is not at all accessible, no one's going to give you feedback on making it accessible because they're not even going to be there. You are going to suffer a business loss that you can't even measure because they will never get into the pipeline. They may never visit the website.
And it's not only people with disabilities that would leave your company. It's also the friends and family. It's, it's much broader group of people.
I had a very specific question that I was thinking, Nick, I had talked earlier about kind of high noise or high sound sensitivity environments. I always wake up before my wife, I lie in bed and read the New York Times. I don't want to play any video. Is there a best practice for notifying users that a video will be captioned? Because I don't even click on video because I don't know if it's going to have captions. Like, I would love a way to start a video and I know it's going to be silent and it's going to have captions. And just for my own personal experience, I would love if there was some best practice around that.
So yeah, I mean, depends on what player you're actually using and integrating, but you can even make it so it's like by default, when you hit play, you have audio off. Now that could get into some questions on, okay, well, not everyone knows how to turn it on. And that's where, okay, yeah, captions, great. Maybe you have to remember to keep your volume settings down on your device or things like that. But that's why I kind of saying the transcript on the page, everyone on a majority of people can read faster than they can listen to something. And many players don't even include, I love it when they do, they have like 1.5, 2 times speed, because even listening to this, you'll probably want to skip all the ums and ahs. And if you have that transcript, that's literally like a play-by-play of everything going on, the scenes, everything. I prefer that. There's plenty of times where similar to yourself, it's like, I don't want to watch the video. I just want to read the content real quick. And so you can get the information you need without needing to go through the video process.
I wish there was always like a button first, like start without sound. And
Yeah,
then with no.
Yeah, and so you can incorporate that. But that's what I'm just like, sometimes with the video player, you could also have user settings, but it's totally possible. But that's where it's, again, if you're retrofitting, you're not really thinking about that. You're probably just gonna be like, what can I do for bare minimum, versus thinking about what are the different types of users and how are they trying to access your content.
And this goes back to what we're talking about, is like expanded access. I can watch video, I can hear just fine, but I have situational disabilities in situations where I don't want to play that. Inka, you had something on your final slide that I just want you to clarify a bit. Your last bullet was shift. You're looking at your final slide now, aren't you? I saw you look off to the side. Your last bullet point was shift left. Can you talk about that, the spatially shifting left? Do you mean left in terms of the publishing process or the development process?
Everything, right? One of my colleagues tells the story about, building a house. An anecdote: if you build a house and then you realize that it doesn't have plumbing, and you start to retrofit the plumbing, that's going to be a huge expense to put on afterwards. But of course, accessibility is an essential. It's like plumbing. You need to have it. It's basically the baseline you need to have. It's stupid to leave it to the last moment.
I have a couple of questions in the Q&A, some very specific questions. I'll give this one to you, Nick. Laura's asking, if you talked about hover and focus as being problematic, if you're not going to do hover and focus, how do you detect intent?
So for me, it's always that when you click on something, when you press something, when you're activating it through a switch, through a keyboard, through touch, you're actually now wanting to do something, right? Now you don't want to trigger things on, like, let's say mouse down or touch start or aspects like that, because that's still not intent yet. I may have accidentally pressed down, but I maybe want to do something else. So many people forget that, and they're like, okay, as soon as you press something, immediately do something. Like, but I haven't even lifted up my finger. Like I was just wanting to scroll, or, oh, I just was looking at something and wanting to select the text. So you really do more mouse up. That's why click JavaScript bindings or anything like that is totally fine. But I kind of go with a reminder, again, keep it simple, is if it looks like a button and acts like a button, make it a button tag. And then you don't have to put any extra functionality. As soon as you add that click functionality, it works for everyone.
This goes back to the concepts that we talked about how the web is kind of designed to be accessible. We just broke it. I saw an article on Hacker News where somebody was talking about a text box, a simple text box, and all of the built-in functionality it has with if we re-implement a text box as some other input element, functionality like if you double click, you get a word. And if you triple click, you select an entire sentence. And there's so much built-in functionality in the web that when we try to re-implement this, as for whatever reason we always seem to do, we just lose out. We forget to re-implement a ton of things that were thought of really when the web was born.
Yeah.
Inka, let's talk about inclusivity and diversity. I do not know. I don't build websites for a living anymore, but I have to say I don't know anyone who is blind. So if I wanted to include a blind person in my kind of development or testing, are there options for me? I mean, how do you go about getting in touch with people that can give you valid feedback like that?
I think you need to just talk with our accessibility team in that case, Deane.
That was a softball
Like
question.
for
for you.
instance, our European team, all of the people doing manual testing have a visual impairment of some kind, different levels, of course. But there are lots of companies doing usability testing who have testers who have disabilities of different kind, right?
Right.
And
So when we
also,
talk about
some ways, also you can connect to different or organization as well, disability organizations. Sometimes they have that network and insight as well to recommend.
So obvious, organic inclusivity is wonderful if we can form our team that way. But if you can't form it organically, you're saying that there are ways to manufacture inclusivity so you can get a broad realm of testing.
Yes, yes. But the best thing would be that your team would be inclusive, that you would hire people with disabilities to your own team.
Absolutely. Let's talk about events. Are there conferences that you know of that focus on accessibility, and are they only for accessibility advocates, or are there designer and developer events and training opportunities around accessibility for people who maybe don't have their careers in accessibility but want to know more about accessibility? Do you guys know of anything in that space?
Well, I know Incubrecht mentioned it, but we were just at CSUN. Their conference is actually, it's in Anaheim, California, but a lot of international people actually do come in for this. And it's actually not, it's also gives you some insight into communities, because it's actually not just for experts, but for people with different disabilities coming in and talking about their lives, trying to understand and work together on improving that. And it also has training and courses, and also just a lot of slides and presentations about, okay, specific topics. But there are also ones across the world. There's like Ally Toronto, so you got Canada, you've got many ones. Inka, I'm not sure if you know ones offhand on the EU or anything like that.
I can find a list of all the events that we are attending. I think we should have a list of all the conferences and send that in a follow-up.
Inka, I think that you made the point that we need to broaden the applicability of accessibility, because I think when we think about accessibility events, you have a lot of people that as soon as they hear about those things, well, that's not for me. I don't need to go to that. I mean, how do we motivate our teams to approach accessibility as something of business value rather than something that's just a niche for accessibility experts like yourself?
Yeah, that's a good question. Probably the most difficult question, because a lot of accessibility teams, especially Stephen, established ones in companies, are still, fighting to get that, budget to work on accessibility and convince, okay, this is actually something that is fundamental on building a base for better website experiences. So definitely a struggle exists. But that's why we're doing these webinars. We're trying to talk, okay, how do you actually convince people working with accessibility? Yeah, good question, Deane. Not a perfect answer.
I think we're all still looking for that answer. Neil makes a point interesting here that the UK government website is often seen as an excellent example of accessibility, right? And is noticeably plain in design. Should we go simpler in web design to facilitate accessibility? So let's take a step back. Is accessibility a battle between design and accessibility? Do we have to compromise design for accessibility? You have any thoughts on that space?
Nick, this is for you.
Okay, I'll jump in. I actually, the way I look at this is, yes, it sets limitations, but the same thing you could say about directors with budgets, and you can actually create really amazing films with actually a budget. Setting some parameters actually sets you to actually create better interfaces. The way I look at it is, that's why design trends, it's not, you say, no offense or anything, it's honestly, we kind of go like, oh, it's plain or it's kind of simple, but that's actually where the trend of design has gone, because from a UX standpoint, you want people to be able to do conversions, you want to be able to find content. And with Web 2.0 and earlier versions, it was like flashy and wow, and you go, okay, we're going to put in so much stuff in design. And then it was actually hard to find things. It was hard to accomplish tasks. So simplifying it actually makes it a lot easier to use. And so it's more of a design trend, not necessarily because of accessibility, but it definitely has that in mind. So yes, going simpler actually does create better things. Now, you could say like, well, we want fancy things too, right? And there is some experiential aspects, but really you can do everything with experience and whatnot and still create a similar experience, just like we were talking about with video, right? You can still do video. You just want to account for all users with that video.
One of the classics that I can think of, like regarding design, that we often end up into conversations is brand colors. When they're inaccessible, because that involves so many different people, and you realize like, why it doesn't, satisfy the VCAC criteria. But when it comes to questions like that, I think, the reason why accessibility VCAC criteria is the way it is, there's always a good reason behind it. So then you can have that conversation with the designer. Hey, by the way, our call to actions are pastel colored. Why would we ever do that? And then, raise those thoughts and, raise that empathy towards the end user as well. I think in the end, there will be consensus that it's not like exclusive, like good design, accessible design. They are not mutually exclusive at all.
I'm reminded of Mike Montero's book, Design is a Job. And he opens that book by saying that design is fundamentally about limitations. If you had no limitations, you wouldn't need design. There would be nothing to design for. So we are fundamentally designing around limitations. And I think accessibility is just another one of those limitations, or another one of those guidelines we need to take into account. With that, we have hit time. I want to thank our two guests, Nick and Inka. Thank you very much for your insights on this conversation. Very important things we're talking about here. And I want to thank everybody for joining us. I'm Deane Barker with Optimizely. It's been a pleasure having you for this webinar, and we will be contacted with the recording. Thank you, everybody, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.